Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to A Cup of Hope with Hope Against Trafficking and the Michigan Abolitionist Project. Today's episode is about understanding human trafficking laws in Michigan. Whether you are new to the issue of human trafficking or you've studied this issue for a length of time, we're so glad that you joined us for this special episode with Assistant Attorney General Kelly Carter as we explore the past, present, and future of human trafficking legislation. Throughout our conversation, we will address topics such as the importance of language and how human trafficking terms have evolved over time, how victims and survivors are treated within the criminal justice system, types of supports and protections that are available, and how we hold one another accountable. You will have the opportunity to submit questions to our panel by typing your questions into Facebook Live event on either Hope Against Trafficking or the Michigan Abolitionist Facebook page, or through Hope Against Trafficking's YouTube page. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation, and we will collect these and address them during the session. Please welcome today's panelists. We have myself, Hannah McPeak. I'm the Education Director at Hope Against Trafficking. We have Emily Johnson, our Program Coordinator at Michigan Abolitionist Project, and Kelly Carter, the Assistant Attorney General. Kelly Carter has been an Assistant Attorney General for over 20 years in the Criminal Division, with past assignments including the High Tech Crime Unit, Child Protection Unit, and the Mortgage Fraud Unit. For the past 10 years, she's focused on prosecuting human traffickers, having convicted over 24 people under the state's human trafficking statute. In 2017, she was appointed by the governor as chair of the Michigan Human Trafficking Commission and works on behalf of the Attorney General with several human trafficking task forces throughout the state. She regularly contributes to the Attorney General's efforts to improve Michigan's criminal law, testifying on over a dozen occasions before Michigan House and Senate subcommittees considering legislation involving child sexual exploitation and human trafficking. She also frequently trains on human trafficking throughout Michigan. So welcome. We're so glad that you could be here with us today. So Emily, why don't you kick us off?
Sure. Yeah, we are just so grateful to have you with us, Kelly. Hannah and I have been studying human trafficking for a long time, and there's even questions that we still have when it comes to legislation. It can be really confusing if you didn't go to school for this kind of stuff, or if you have any experience. So there's going to be a handful of questions that I am just super curious to know the answer to today.
As am I. Yeah.
But to start, would you like to give us a little background of, so you're the Assistant Attorney General, or?
I am one of hundreds of assistant attorneys general. So we've got a great big staff in the office, and primarily the Office of Attorney General is legal counsel for state agencies, kind of like the law firm for the state. But there's some other areas where, things are slightly different. So while most of that, the focus of the office is civil law, the Attorney General actually is the, chief law enforcement officer in the state of Michigan, and is vested with all the prosecutorial authority within the state. But by practice and history, the Attorney General has delegated most of that prosecutorial authority to the county prosecutors. Those are independent elected individuals that then, take that delegated authority. But within the office of Attorney General, so for the most part, the county prosecutor is going to take care of most criminal activity in a particular jurisdiction. We tend to step in or in situations where maybe there's conflict of interest, where a county prosecutor doesn't have the ability, can't pursue a case because of parties involved. We will be able to take that case. But as a general rule tool, our office has created sort of specialty areas that might employ too many resources for a county prosecutor's office to pursue specifically. So within, my history within the office, I started out in the high-tech crime unit, which again, that was an area that required, back in the day, a good deal of specialized training and information. So same thing with human trafficking generally, throughout the state, is the office has, identified that and sort of made that a priority. And because the prosecution of these cases tends to be very resource intensive, meaning that it often takes a good amount of time, most offices have difficulty devoting resources to, either a particular unit or people to be able to, spend adequate time to do the cases appropriately. And so we build up relationships with law enforcement agencies, task forces, and Michigan State Police and others who are trained in this area. And they will come to us, or we might work together with a county prosecutor on a particular case. So as we get further into it, we're seeing more of an expansion of county prosecutors sort of coming on board and developing the expertise and resources to be able to handle these cases. So
awesome. It's a lot. Now
Wow. Yeah. I didn't realize.
Makes a lot more sense now. Okay. In other words, we have the pro here with us today. She knows all the answers.
Well, no. I don't know all of the answers, but I'm fortunate in that the area that I specialize in, I'm able to specialize in it, right? Mm-hmm. So the more time you spend in an area, the more expertise you're able to develop in that area, obviously. So again, because of the way that our office is set up and, sort of how things work, I've been able to focus my efforts on the trafficking prosecution. So.
Nice. Okay.
Well, it's such an honor to have you here with us. That's
thanks.
Your expertise is going to be really beneficial. So I'm sorry, Emily, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, absolutely. I agree. So let's begin with federal law. So what is kind of like history, where we're at now, how this all came about with in terms of federal human trafficking law? What do we recommend?
Well, one thing I like to point out quite often when we're talking about human trafficking law and legislation is that it's all pretty much brand new, right? So when we're talking about other areas of law, most crimes have sort of been on the books, for the most part for, dozens, if not hundreds of years. And so everyone sort of knows what we're talking about. But surprisingly, there was not a law against human trafficking until 2000, when the first federal law against trafficking was passed. Right. I know it's crazy. So we're only 20 years in. And so that really is pretty insignificant when we're looking at the development of law and what those areas of litigation within that. So the first federal law was passed in 2000, and that basically established, the two sort of areas, the sex trafficking and labor trafficking, right? So creating the federal prohibition against those two sort of distinct acts that we call human trafficking today, right? So that it wasn't until 2000, and then Michigan didn't get into the game until several years later, and I'm still dealing with my son here. Sorry, maybe I'll scoot this way. Okay, there. Michigan didn't pass its first law until 2006. Right. as far as the details of the federal law and what it targeted, Emily, did you want to ask about that, or?
Yeah. So if we look at the definition, that federal definition of sex trafficking, it says sex trafficking is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining, patronizing, soliciting, and or advertising of a person for the purpose of a sex act, which we will define what is a commercial sex act, in which the commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform such an act has not attained 18 years of age. So that's a mouthful.
Right. Yeah.
There's a lot to unpack there. So let's start with some of these, this recruitment, harboring, transportation, patronizing, soliciting. The patronizing, soliciting, and advertising are only in cases of sex trafficking. That's not applied to labor trafficking. So what are some of those terms? Do you want to pick some of those out and give some like real life examples of what some of those words mean?
Yeah, sure. And in fact, oftentimes you'll see the idea of trafficking represented in this act means purpose model, with the idea the act being these verbs that you've listed off, the means being the force, fraud, or coercion, and then the purpose being this idea of it's either for commercial sex or for the labor trafficking services obtained that way. But when we're talking about the act, the federal definition is sort of, the mainstay when we're talking about the acts involved. Recruiting, harboring, transporting, providing, obtaining. Actually, the Michigan law echoes those same verbs. It would seem that those are appropriately encompassing, right? That when we're looking at something that somebody would be doing, again, a verb, engaging in an act with somebody else, what are the acts that a trafficker would be engaging in? And so it seems like these are good verbs to sort of encompass that activity. But sometimes I wonder as a practitioner, when I'm standing before a finder of fact, whether that's in Michigan in front of a judge as part of a preliminary examination where I'm establishing that there's some basis to the case, or whether it's a jury at the trial stage. Ultimately, as the prosecutor, I have to establish how I've met the elements of the crime, including the various verbs, right? Which are recruiting, harboring, transporting. And I have found myself in circumstances where I'm like, I'm not sure which verb most appropriately encompasses the activity that I'm looking at. So, for instance, in one particular case, we had a young woman who was she was definitely recruited. Whether the moment of her recruitment was for the purpose of commercial sex, I don't really know. But once the commercial sex started, then we definitely know that she was being kept in a hotel room, sort of, restrained in the hotel room. If she left, there would be what she believed some consequences based upon, some information provided by her trafficker. So I was sort of aiming for, okay, that kind of sounds like harboring, right? But then again, how often do you use the term harbor? Not so much, right? And so even within the legal profession, we have to make an argument for what harboring means, which is to keep someone for the purposes of, right? To sort of keep someone kind of tucked away for the purposes of this commercial sex. And it turns out in this particular case, while I was making the argument that harboring was the appropriate verb, the judge thought, no, I think that the providing this person for commercial sex is more appropriate, and, made a finding based upon that. But the reality is that, we have these verbs in there. the legislature identifies and includes these verbs, and it's the practitioners who are left to sort of parse it out in the courtroom as to, well, what does that actually mean? Even providing somebody for commercial sex. It's sometimes I tend to think of that, or I'll make an argument that if you're taking out an ad and posting an ad, that ad is really providing the access to this person, right, for the commercial sexual activity. So I tend to think that that's providing. However, a different prosecutor could think that it's something different. Same thing with obtaining. Obtaining gets to be, I don't know, ambiguous or maybe vague in some circumstances. Again, is that doubling over recruiting somebody? You say the words that recruit them, hey, do you want to? And then, you take them. Is that the obtaining before you put them in the car and transport them for it? Like, are each of those separate things? So, as a practitioner, I sometimes wonder whether it helps or whether it might help to look a little closer at some of these verbs that we use for the purposes of actually, litigating these terms. But I mean, for the most part, with as long a list as we have, those verbs. Especially the federal legislature on the first time out was pretty good at sort of identifying a full spectrum of acts that I don't think I found myself yet at a loss for, I don't have a verb in the statute that covers the act that this fact pattern that I'm reviewing looks at. So, so that's where, sort of the generalities of the words that we choose in the statute meet the realities of practice and how we see it in reality.
Awesome.
So how would you then define commercial sex act?
Well, so those are generally defined by statute, and for the most part, it is this idea of a sex act for something of value. And the reason that it's not just money is we want to recognize and understand, that oftentimes there is an exchange of addictive substances for commercial sex or for a sex act, right? And there's a certain amount of exploitation that can happen under those circumstances. Same thing with housing or, sometimes even just necessities, right? Those are all things that we want to make sure that the law recognizes as being exchanged for the particular sex act.
And so it can be actually having sex with a person. It couldn't going to a strip club or pornography or watching someone's personal videos. How does that kind of all, where's the line with commercial sex act?
Right. So under the Michigan definition of commercial sex act, the actual act itself borrows other sort of sexual definitions from the penal code. So that includes the definitions of sexual activity that's encompassed by the criminal sexual conduct statute, or what would generally be referred to as our rape statute, right? So those are encompassed, as well as definitions under our child sexual exploitation law, which is our what we call child sexually abusive activity, which is also includes our child pornography, right? So that's all included in there. And then it does also include sexual performances. So that would cover a situation. And we've heard about, this happening in Michigan, where it doesn't have to be a minor, but it can also be an adult, where perhaps they're voluntarily engaging in sharing, a sexually explicit performance online, but unbeknownst to them, it might be videoed. And then if that's used as a point of exploitation. If you don't do it again for me, then we're going to post this, right? So that would be covered in that circumstance.
Okay, that clears some things up. Thank you. So what is, and then if someone is under the age of 18, it's always considered human. Well, and if they are providing a commercial sex act and they're under the age of 18 in exchange for money or something of value, then it's always considered human trafficking, regardless if force, fraud, or
Correct.
coercion can be in or were exhibited.
Well, and that gets interesting too, because I've had a couple minor sex trafficking cases where even though force, fraud, or coercion isn't involved, sometimes it can get tricky where we have a very willingly involved minor. So for instance, I had one case where I'm pretty sure, based upon the minor's statements, as well as some other witnesses, that this minor was basically running the show, and that this minor recruited the trafficker to get her hotel room because she can, right? Or to take her back and forth. So that technically, clearly is a violation of the statute, right? That he transported and harbored and provided her, got the room for her, even if it was at her insistence or her suggestion, right? So even though we did, pursue charges against the trafficker in that situation, but, where or how that sort of case resolves and whether or not we want to take that case to a jury who maybe might tend to not, feel so certain about the technicalities of the law in that circumstance. So we don't have to have force, fraud, or coercion as long as there's a minor engaging in commercial sex and somebody else involved, right? So you still have to have the target, which is the trafficker, in order for it to be minor sex trafficking. But yeah, there's no requirement of force, fraud, or coercion. Unfortunately, oftentimes we do see force, fraud, or coercion, but it's not required.
Interesting. Okay. And then last question on, I don't know, we could explore what is force, fraud, and coercion if we want to real quick. But I also want to know, what is the main difference between human trafficking and prostitution?
Well, so human trafficking, as a general umbrella term, includes labor trafficking and sex trafficking. And so sex trafficking almost always includes prostitution, but not all prostitution is sex trafficking, right? So we have sort of this Venn diagram of commercial sexual activity that's happening as a result of force, fraud, or coercion, or minors, which would be sex trafficking, and then commercial sexual activity that's happening not under those circumstances. Now, there's also Michigan law contains a provision against pandering, which is pimping, right? So that's not force, fraud, or coercion, but it does include, influence from another person. So there's, sort of a spectrum from the more severe force, fraud, or coercion to still some influence, some promise, some potential threats involved. And then finally, at the far end, we have very little data to support this, but a whole lot of sort of real life exposure to indicate that folks that are out there, not through the influence of anybody else, right? At the far end of the spectrum, who are sort of willingly, through no other influence of anybody else, engaging in commercial sexual activity, then that would be sort of, prostitution, consensual prostitution.
Mm-hmm. And even that's tricky because willingness, consensual. I mean, if this is someone's only opportunity or chance at making some money because of their job opportunities, or they're just in a desperate situation, other opportunities aren't available to them. So yeah, that willingness and consensual can get tricky too.
Well, and that's when, even when we're looking at the idea of force, fraud, or coercion, and we try to do training with law enforcement, and point out the idea that force, fraud, or coercion, in law enforcement, we don't want to just ask a conclusory question. Were you forced? My experience is that most of the time, people who are clearly victims of trafficking would answer that question, no. Even if the facts that we walk through would clearly establish, that they were forced or that they were coerced, So when we're looking at these issues of force, fraud, or coercion, we have to really, build up the facts that support the conclusion rather than just asking or jumping to a conclusion, without real examination of exactly, like you pointed out, those same sort of issues, that even somebody can be involved in a romantic relationship with their trafficker, and they might be convinced by the, coercion of their trafficker that they're engaging in commercial sexual activity willingly, because their trafficker might have said, well, you have a choice, either you do this or we don't have a future and I'm done with you. And so under those circumstances, it wouldn't be uncommon at all for that person to believe that they are making a willful choice. Yet when we step back and look objectively at that person's situation, it's pretty easy to see that it's not so willing a choice.
Thank you for making that distinction, Kelly. And that's a way more effective way. I mean, that's almost the most common way that traffickers recruit people, is because if you're kidnapping people, they're going to be resistant, and you're not going to want to do anything that you say or tell them. And so if you can make them believe that they're making the choice on their own, that psychological manipulation, coercion, it's a lot more effective.
And some will say even, I didn't even know that there was a term. I didn't even know what human trafficking was, or, so when you're having even that initial dialogue where, like you were saying, Kelly, you don't just ask the question, oh, were you forced or, coerced? There are individuals out there who had no idea this was even happening to them, that didn't know how to define it or find the words to express what was going on and what was happening to them. So to have the wherewithal to consider all of the pieces and to look at the evidence and slowly help somebody journey through that is obviously extremely beneficial and, the way to go.
Yeah, and when we're talking about the terms too, again, taking it from how it happens to the legal process of holding somebody accountable for it. It's important that the definitions in the statute for force, fraud, and coercion, they provide some illustrations, but they also say that this is not an exhaustive list. They leave open the possibility that what might be coercion for one person in one particular circumstance may not necessarily be coercive for another. It all is really based upon the vulnerabilities of a victim that they bring when they're encountering their trafficker, and the ways in which the trafficker is going to exploit those vulnerabilities. So, it's important, and it certainly is helpful that those definitions are open, so that we have the opportunity to make the argument for where all those facts add up to, whether it's coercion or fraud or force. So.
Awesome. Okay, so then let's switch over to labor trafficking. Very similar definition. Labor trafficking is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purposes of subjection to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. So, what do you want to pull apart in that?
Yeah. So, so it's the same kind of thing. Act means, or act means purpose. But the whole idea here is that the real distinction between sex trafficking and labor trafficking is the thing that is being asked of the victim. In sex trafficking, it's that sex act, right? In labor trafficking, it's labor or services. So it's somebody toiling to some event that is not sex, right? And that could be any number of things. And where there's an important distinction between those two is the fact that when we're talking about labor trafficking, but for that force, fraud, or coercion, the thing that's being asked of the victim is otherwise legitimate, right? Whereas in sex trafficking, the thing that's being asked of the victim is illegitimate, is, contraband. So we have a slightly, I think, harder time when we're looking at the fact that it's labor or service, and but for that force, fraud, or coercion, it wouldn't be trafficking. And so I find that while it's easier to say that sex trafficking might be more applicable in looking for a criminal solution, what we tend to find is that it's far more difficult to apply a criminal standard to a labor trafficking case because of that fact that, the service is legitimate from the get-go. And so when we're talking about this idea of involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, the Michigan statute includes those concepts as well. But you'd be surprised at how often this idea of debt bondage comes into play. And I see it both in labor trafficking as well as sex trafficking cases. The words certainly would imply, some kind of shackles or something along those lines. But really the concept is this: it's the idea of either an undefined or an ever increasing debt that the person is not going to ever be able to satisfy. And so we can see this in a situation where perhaps, somebody travels to this country for a work situation, and they're promised a certain wage. And they think that sounds great. And then they get here, and the employer then sort of changes things up on them, right? And says, all right, well, we're not going to pay you, the $12 an hour we promised. We're only going to pay you $8 an hour. But you have to pay for your transportation, and you have to pay for your room, and you have to pay for your food. And all of that adds up to far more than they would ever be able to, reasonably make. So they're toiling then, sort of forever in the debt of the person that they've agreed to pay this debt to. And again, that's where you see this force, fraud, or coercion. If you ask them if they were forced, they're going to say, well, no, I agreed to this job, right? I agreed to come here and do this. But when we step back and look objectively at it, we see, well, you sort of walked them into a corner where they really had no other choice. Labor trafficking, we see it in Michigan. And in fact, I had a case involving some foreign national healthcare providers that it touched on this debt bondage idea. It touched on the area of fraud, that they were, lied about the working situation, that there was additional debt that was added on. There were other threats that were made as far as if they tried to leave, then they would be held accountable for thousands of dollars of liquidated damages. So all of that, really went into creating, what I thought was a really good picture of sort of force, fraud, and coercion all at the same time, indicating that these people would not have been working for this person but for those factors. So that was a case that was probably more applicable to a criminal situation, simply because we'd be able to prove that beyond a reasonable doubt, which is, really what we're looking at in a criminal application in these cases.
Wow. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you for that clarification. What about, so how do people how is labor trafficking identified? How did that case come about? Who blew the whistle, or how?
Well, I think, I was alerted to it by a third party who was aware of the circumstance of the individuals who were performing the work. And I think that the third party sort of had some training, or at least had been alerted to the idea of trafficking. And then when hearing the story said, hey, that sounds like trafficking, right? When it comes to labor trafficking, I also, I receive tips from the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And we see those come in since we've seen the mandate for training for healthcare providers. We've seen a lot more tips coming in from healthcare providers. Yep. Sometimes, again, a labor trafficking case may not necessarily get to law enforcement, simply because there are other civil means that are sometimes more appropriate to be able to deal with it, such as wage and hour violations, some civil suits and things along those lines. So, there, luckily in certain industries, there are, legal providers that are helpful to folks, in the agricultural, migrant labor, in that sort of area, helpful for those folks in those circumstances. But otherwise, I think at least ones that I've looked at from a criminal standpoint, generally it's somebody who's received some information about what labor trafficking looks like. And so, there's a construction case that I looked at, there's some landscaping information, so it's usually some sort of outsider that has received some public awareness information or training on trafficking and says, I'm seeing some red flags here.
Yeah, because oftentimes too, with labor trafficking, there's other laws that are being violated too, that oftentimes, or that sometimes could be easier to try. So that would be sometimes maybe the angle to go in order to bring about a resolution or some sort of, prosecution or. Sometimes
it's obviously we want to do all that we can to get help for a victim of trafficking, right?
Absolutely.
And so oftentimes that civil path is the appropriate path to ensure that they get some redress for what happened to them. The bad thing about that, though, is that, then we don't have a stat. We don't have as much data. And that's one thing that we know is a huge challenge in this area. And especially when we're looking at wanting to go to the legislature to change the law, to tighten things up, or say we need more help in certain areas, data helps support those arguments. And so, there's always this sort of vicious cycle where we're looking for as much information as possible to create data points so that we have the information we need to make the arguments. So,
yeah, and that's what makes labor trafficking that much more difficult, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and it's harder to track. I mean, it's happening. From what I understand, some of the numbers, it's and again, statistics are statistics that, right, with regard to human trafficking, you just don't really know. But there's a lot more cases related to human trafficking than we realize, because oftentimes it's hidden, oftentimes it's less easy to provide that evidence path, that leads to trafficking, although it's happening.
Right.
How encouraging is that?
Hard. It's like,
what's that?
That's just so encouraging, though. Like, these trainings are really paying off in a lot of situations that just everyday people
Mhm.
can become aware of what the red flags and signs of sex and labor trafficking are. And a lot of times when they call the Polaris, the National Human Trafficking Hotline, and give that tip, that's the evidence that they need or that they're looking for, and that can save somebody's life. And
Absolutely.
Yeah.
happening all the time. So, okay, so let's go back to Michigan law specifically. So, what are some important details about Michigan laws in place now? So, like thinking about traffickers, victim survivors, people who are buying sex buyers. What are some of like, who's criminalized in the criminal justice system? Who is offered services and support? How does the criminal justice system deal with this and treat people? What are the consequences
Sure.
you're looking
You
at?
know, yeah, Michigan's law is even newer, like even more of a baby than the federal law. So our first law was enacted in 2006, and that law, the language of that law included the concepts of force, fraud, and coercion, some of the concepts that are included in the federal law, but they used different language. And then there was an amendment in 2011. Frankly, I don't know if anyone had charged under the 2006 law. I don't know if there had been any charges brought. I wasn't aware of any. And then in 2011, there was an amendment to the law, which was somewhat unusual in that rather than striking out parts of the 2006 law and adding in new language, they sort of created a whole new section of trafficking and plopped it right down next to the 2006 law. So there was, for a period of time, essentially two trafficking laws on the books, which you might think great, but no, because they use slightly different terminology. They were slightly different. There were penalties that were different between the two schemes, and so it really was a situation that's not a good situation to have that ambiguity between the two statutes. And so in 2014, as a result of the first temporary commission, we instituted a number of changes that, sort of brought the terminology of the Michigan statute into line with the federal statute. But, we did some extra work there too. I mean, we created a provision specifically for minor labor trafficking. So in addition to having the explicit minor sex trafficking, we also created a specific provision for minor labor trafficking with a higher penalty for that. Again, where we're looking at, victimizing minors, we want to treat that more seriously. But this, this package of bills in 2014 also created protections. So we talk about this concept of safe harbor, where we want to recognize victims of trafficking as victims of a crime and not criminals for those actions that they are forced to engage in at the hands of their traffickers. Michigan's first attempt at safe harbor was limited, right? So the first attempt at safe harbor provided protections for those who are facing penalties for commercial sex. So that was the limit of it, is that, if you're an adult facing commercial sex charges as a result of trafficking, the law created a diversion opportunity. So a way for you to avoid criminal prosecution for that commercial sex act engaged at the hand of the trafficker. For minors, we created, again, it was limited just to commercial sex. And the law had already provided complete immunity for anybody under 16. So no minor under 16 could ever be accountable for a commercial sex act. But the law created what's called a rebuttable presumption, that anybody 16 or 17 that's engaging in commercial sex is presumed to be a victim of trafficking. And that means that the law basically says you're a victim of trafficking unless a prosecutor can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that you are not a victim of trafficking. And so, I recognize that there's, some concern out there as to whether or not that actually offers protection for those 16 or 17-year-olds. But the reality is that in order to overcome that presumption, one would essentially have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, right, that somebody was guilty of a criminal act. Those things as we're going forward, there are a number of provisions that have been recommended by the commission at this point to greatly expand those protections. So to take that limitation just of commercial sex out of there, but to protect victims for convictions of all number of crimes that we know from experience in dealing with victims and prosecutions, that they are, asked to engage in all sorts of criminal activity, and that realistically we need to make sure that we're doing all that we can to prevent them from being held criminally liable for those actions.
Yeah, there's an article that came out out of the Spartan newsroom in September of 2021 that talks about that, like the getting rid of the criminal charges of, for example, one of the examples that they give is, somebody who's being trafficked is running away from the trafficker, and in doing that and trying to get away from the hands of the trafficker, they steal a car to try to find safety somewhere. So that, or they're carrying drugs because their life is at risk. They're trying to get away. They have it on their possession, and so those are some of the examples that they, things to clear their record so that they can get the help and the support and protections that they need.
Yeah, and the aim of criminal law is to hold people accountable for their guilty actions, right?
Yeah.
And when we're talking about a victim of trafficking who is doing it again out of necessity, duress, or because they're under some force, fraud, or coercion, we as a society don't benefit from holding that person accountable, because we're not undoing or deterring some future action or penalizing them for actions, that they intended or wanted to do. So,
right.
So what kind of consequences and penalties are in place for someone who is a trafficker?
Well, so it lawyer answer, it depends. So, it starts out when we're talking about trafficking, the penalties start out at 10 years. And that is for what sort of what I call your kinder, gentler sort of labor trafficking situation. So if maybe fraud was the method of control, lying to somebody or misrepresenting the circumstances in order to get them to continue, nobody's hurt, there's no sort of physical violence, but that labor or service is being obtained through that fraud, then that would be subject to a 10-year penalty. Now the penalties certainly go up from there based upon the sort of circumstances of the crime. So if it's sex trafficking versus labor trafficking, that starts at a 15-year. So if the thing you're asking from the victim is that sexual act, that starts at a 15-year penalty. Or likewise, if your labor trafficking involved physical injury. So if somebody is harmed in the process, then that warrants a higher penalty. Same thing with if your victim is a minor, or if there was some serious physical injury, that takes it up another level, right, to sort of 20 years. And then we have, if the trafficking involved some other very, very serious crime, including, what we call criminal sexual conduct in the first degree, which is, the most serious sort of rape situations, or kidnapping, or the death of somebody, some other crime that's punishable by life, then the trafficking would also be punishable by life. So, it's a whole range of criminal penalties depending on how the crime was committed and what the circumstances were.
That is very helpful. Okay. But all the time, the trafficker is telling the victim that they are the ones that are going to get in trouble. Don't report them to the police because you will just be seen as a prostitute and they're going to lock you up and you're going to get in trouble, when really, in reality, there are a lot more, there's much more of a safety net in place for survivors and victims of human trafficking.
Right. And along those lines too, we've seen as the national immigration policy has evolved, we see that same sort of threat in labor trafficking situations, just as forceful, that you're going to get in trouble if you were to say anything, because if it's a foreign national who is, at under the control, either the trafficker has their documents or the trafficker is providing, the visa information, then that same kind of threat can be just as powerful in a labor trafficking situation.
Or
absolutely. You just say you're breaking the law, so you're going to be the one that's going to get tried. You're here illegally, so you don't have any out.
Okay, so then real quick, what are the consequences for someone who may be seeking to buy commercial sex or a paid sex act?
Well, so not everybody who seeks to buy a commercial sex act is purchasing the product of trafficking, right? Again, we talked about that sort of spectrum of the commercial sexual activity and where and how that sort of crosses over with, prostitution generally or general sort of commercial sex. However, in those circumstances where the person who is providing the commercial sex act is a minor, that 2014 package created a new penalty, so that if somebody is purchasing sex from a minor, that is now a 5-year penalty, a 5-year felony, as opposed to, as the law stands today, generally a purchaser of a commercial sex act is going to be subject to a misdemeanor, 93-day misdemeanor. And so at that, there's some federal law which would seem to indicate that the obtaining language in both the federal and the state statute could potentially apply to a buyer. But I think that tends to get tricky. I think that there would have to be some knowledge imputed or imparted to the buyer to know that there was sex trafficking involved. But as a general rule, no, we're just talking about misdemeanors.
If we look back to how and why human trafficking happens, we think about, the principles of supply and demand. There is this demand for commercial sex and cheap goods and services, but there's not enough willing people in those industries to provide that service. So that's why human trafficking exists, because traffickers take advantage of that and then have to take advantage of other people to create that supply to then meet that demand. So if we're thinking about this just in the principles of supply and demand, you would think that, well, if you want to kind of put a dent in this or help stop it, you would start looking at demand. How do we end demand or reduce the demand for commercial sex? So is there any, does Michigan have any plans of creating harsher penalties for sex buyers or people who are looking to buy commercial sex?
Yeah, so right now, at the end of 2019, we went through the commission went through another round of, close examination of our state's laws. And at the end of 2019, we proposed a package of legislative changes. And included in that was some of the things we've already talked about, expanding protections for victims of trafficking. But, one of the important things that we looked at was, again, this idea of, some of the potential misconceptions regarding commercial sex and how that how that reflects on victims of sex trafficking, and sort of that industry generally. And the proposals that were recommended by the commission included some really important measures, such as removing the word prostitution and replacing that with the term of commercial sexual activity. But also sort of re-examining the penalties within commercial sex generally, right? So not even looking within sex trafficking, but commercial sex generally, and recognizing this idea that probably the vast majority of commercial sex that is being provided by people who are not doing so voluntarily or consensually, that there's somebody else, a trafficker, a pimp, or maybe even circumstances that are encouraging or causing the provision of that commercial sex. And under those circumstances, then we want to provide protections for those people who are doing it, again, not necessarily willingly. So the proposals look at reducing penalties for those who are providing commercial sex consensually, but protecting those who are providing it at the influence of somebody else. So not just victims of sex trafficking, but victims of pimps or pandering, right? Because that's a 20-year felony. And we want to look at, the victims of that crime like we are at victims of sex trafficking. But at the same time, recognizing the idea that the provider of the Commercial Sex Act is the person who's most vulnerable in the exchange, whereas the buyer, kind of swoops in, does the deed and then goes back to their life, right? And they put the money on the table and then they're gone. And so recognizing the sort of the risk and vulnerability and the imbalance of the power of the two parties to that act, the Commission recommended increasing penalties for buyers of all commercial sex, right? So looking at starting at a very low level felony, but a felony nonetheless, to sort of try and create some balance where there's that imbalance in that very uneven financial interaction between those people.
I'm glad you mentioned that power dynamic.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And there's been reported a lot of violence at the hands of sex buyers as well. So I would imagine, if the victim or survivor came forward and said this guy, had a gun and was, I'm sure the penalties would increase even if there were violence introduced or that happened in that situation.
Yeah, I mean, certainly that, that would give rise to other criminal charges as well. If there was an assault or
Yes.
say those would all be separate charges, apart from the commercial sex charge.
Okay. Well, we got a couple more minutes. Got to start wrapping up. I have two questions so we can figure out okay. So, I guess we kind of talked about the hopes and plans for future legislation in Michigan. If there's anything else you want to add to that, otherwise I was just going to say, what can we say to listeners today to encourage them, how can they play a part in what we've learned today?
Yeah, so as I indicated, we have these bills pending. They were originally introduced last year. COVID certainly impacted, getting legislation through and moving during, all of the emergency attention that was paid last year. They were introduced again this year, and there has been a little bit of movement on them, but they are still in committee. And so we're going to have to see if we're able to sort of get things done before the end of the year. But if not, then I anticipate that the commission will continue to support those legislative changes. In addition to that's not all that we're looking at. We're looking at other areas, other things that are sort of developing in patterns across the country, sort of looking at providing services to vulnerable youth for a longer period of time to help reduce their vulnerability, some of those things. So we're going to look forward to, working with the legislature as much as we can to try and get those things through. But, to the extent that folks out there, like to talk to their legislators or encourage their legislators to take action or to support certain measures, then certainly we would encourage that. But more importantly, as we talked about, and as you noticed, Emily, the idea that the more people know and understand, right, and make an effort to really look at the realities of trafficking and not to fall prey so much to some of those easily consumed myths or misconceptions that are out there, such as the white van in the big box store parking lot trying to scoop up some suburban teenage person. That certainly could be trafficking and it could happen, but I've never, in any of my cases, never seen it happen that way. Again, it's that vulnerability of the victim that makes them sort of easy prey and far easier and more profitable for a trafficker. So learning and understanding really how it happens and what we can do to help reduce those vulnerabilities, I think are important steps that people can take in joining the fight against trafficking.
Yeah, I love that you said that, because that's the biggest thing. That's why we exist. That's why we have Cup of Hope. That's why we wanted to create, my heartbeat was to just create this platform for engaging in substantive conversations about things that we want people to be talking about. And I love, it's about opening your mouth and just talking about the things. Share this Cup of Hope episode with those around you and just, talk about it, so that, like you guys were both noting the fact that the more education there is, the more that someone can actually do about it. And you've seen that happen.
Yeah.
It's the benefit of someone being educated and then saying something and doing something about it. And so that our heartbeat, our goal is to just equip our listeners, equip everybody, as many people as we can, with this knowledge and this information, and encourage everyone to continue to educate themselves in this, and be empowered to say something when you see something. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been
my gosh.
Thank you
so great
for all that you do. You are excellent at what you do. And it's so great to have someone as knowledgeable and experienced as you in this position to just make that kind of change that is necessary in Michigan. Thank you so much for joining us. I know I learned a lot on this episode, and I'll be sharing this episode with others in my own circle. This was such a benefit. This was an awesome episode. Thank you so much for joining us, Kelly.
Great. Thanks again so much for having me. It's my pleasure. And, we got to get the word out there and get people on board.
That's right.
That's right. Share a couple of words today, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Bye.